shelter first, and there was no room in the inn, per se. They referred me out here. And
the shelter referred you out here?
The shelter referred me out here.
You lived in your own home, and you end up living in these conditions. It does what to your spirit, your soul? How do you...
You feel frustrated. You get so frustrated. It's like, why couldn't they help me when I was out there? Why did I have to be homeless to get help?
Welcome back to Morning Joe. That was a scene from the Poverty Tour, the PBS series airing this week, featuring the People's Tavis Smiley and Dr. Cornel West met in their 18-city, 11-state bus tour to highlight poverty in America. And Dr. Cornel West and Tavis Smiley join us now from Los Angeles. We also have Howard Dean back at the table, along with the editor of NationalMemo.com, Joe Conason.
Boy, I am surrounded by so many Republicans this morning.
Yes.
This is very exciting.
You have
very exciting.
Earlier.
Let's talk about the Poverty Tour. You guys actually were ahead of the Occupy Wall Street crowd by talking about the disparity between the richest and the poorest in America. You went on a tour, and you're going to show us what you found in this PBS special. How important is this issue to the health not only of America, but of even American capitalism?
Yeah. First of all, Joe and Mika, good to be back on, and good morning to Howard and to John, to Joe rather. I'm sorry. It's a very important issue, perhaps the most important, given that the poor in this country are growing, Joe, exponentially. We got out in August to spend days on the road, as you said, 11 states, 18 cities, staying at night with poor families as we traveled. One night we stayed on the streets all night with homeless persons literally steps away from the U.S. Capitol, because this issue is important enough to not be pushed to the sidelines. In the last presidential debate, Dr. West and I sat here listening, interestingly, to your last conversation, the last segment about the politics of this election. But let's go back just a few years, Joe and Mika. In the last race for the White House, my colleague at PBS, Charlie Rose, is moderating this debate on Bloomberg tonight. But in the last round of debates between McCain and Obama, in 3 debates, the word poor or poverty doesn't come up one time. The economy is literally tanking at that moment. The word poor or poverty doesn't come up one time. McCain doesn't say it. Obama doesn't say it. The moderators don't raise it. I hope Charlie won't do that tonight. I suspect he won't. But poverty has got to be raised higher on the American agenda. And this tour was about doing our small part. And this PBS series this week will showcase you what we saw, what we felt, what we learned, and what we heard.
Dr. West, you could go back a generation, not just 2008, and you can pull the transcripts of presidential debates for over the past 30 years in general elections. You don't hear poverty being talked about. You don't talk about the poor being talked about. You always hear about middle-class concerns. The middle class is being crunched. The middle class is blah, blah, blah. But there hasn't really been a political constituency for the poor for a generation.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I do give credit to Brother John Edwards, who tried to raise the issue, but you have to go back to Martin Luther King Jr., who actually died at the very moment he was trying to organize poor people. But I think what Brother Tavis was able to bring to bear, because it was his idea for the tour, and I'm just so blessed to go on the tour with him. But just as anti-Mormon prejudice is as evil as anti-black prejudice, there's a prejudice against poor people. Poor people have been dehumanized. Poverty has been criminalized. 42% of our precious children of all colors live at or near poverty. That is a national disgrace.
You know, I think what may help inject this into the conversation, we talk about how Afghanistan doesn't come up at the debates and it isn't enough of a part of the conversation. I look at your second show on the Poverty Tour schedule, I Had Everything, and it's a show that focuses on the new poor. Howard Dean, with so many more people finding themselves in a very, very difficult situation, can the conversations change, and is Occupy Wall Street the beginning of that?
I hope it is. Here's the problem. Leaving aside the morality of what we're doing with a huge group of poor people in the richest country on the face of the earth, the social stability is something that people who are governing ought to worry about. I mean, I was appalled by the Republican reaction to the Occupy Wall Street people. Oh, Wall Street are our friends. This really isn't about Wall Street. This is about a society in which our values are out of whack. In any society, whether it's China or the United States or France before the revolution, if you have people, a huge gap between the wealthy and the poor. It means that people no longer believe in the system. And when Americans stop believing in the system, America is finished.
And by the way, Willie, at the top of the show, I asked about American capitalism, because when you start hearing people like Alan Greenspan saying the growing divergence between the rich and the poor is a threat to American capitalism itself, a former libertarian, then you know we have crossed the Rubicon.
When you have 15% of all Americans poor, that's something to be contended with. That's something we have to deal with. And Tavis and Dr. West, it's good to see you both. It's Willie. You've done a good job doing what you two can do, which is to shine a light on the problem. But now we have to worry about what flows from that. You've given the light. Now, what can Washington do? Do you have any faith that Washington can do anything, given the gridlock we've seen, Tavis, in even smaller matters than this? What's the big thing Washington can do to help you?
Well, let me answer your question two ways. Dr. West always makes the distinction between optimism and hope. Optimism suggests there is a particular set of facts or circumstances or conditions, really, that give you reason to believe that things are going to get better. That's not the case right now, but we can always remain hopeful, even without the evidence. And I, as an American, choose to remain hopeful that if we continue to apply the pressure, if those of us in the media and beyond do what we can to raise the issue, if we challenge folk to re-examine their assumptions about the poor, if we give them or help them create a new inventory of ideas about what to do about the poor, I'm hopeful that something can happen. More specifically, this jobs bill has got to get passed. The Senate, as we know, is apparently taking it up this week. I hope the president this time won't compromise, capitulate, or cave, but that we have the courage, conviction, and commitment to draw a line in the sand and fight. I keep quoting my grandfather who said, Tavis, there's some fights that ain't worth fighting even if you win, but there are other fights that you have to fight even if you lose. This is a fight that must be fought, and the president must figure out a way to make sure that Americans have more jobs. That's what the real crisis is. It's a jobs crisis, as we all know. In the long run, we have to figure out a way to eradicate poverty. That's a long-run goal, and it can be done. There are all kinds of plans. The Children's Defense Fund, or Sojourners, or Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia, all kinds of plans around for how to eradicate poverty in the long run. That is 15, 20 years. In the short run, though, we need jobs, and somebody in Washington has to fight. We learned finally on this tour, very simply, that the new poor, Joe, the new poor in this country are the former middle class. You talked about the middle class. That's who the new poor are, the former middle class. So this playing to the middle class ain't going to work this time around.
Isn't it true, Tavis and Dr. West, that the real root of the problem is growing inequality, and that this is actually at the root of our economic problems as well? As Joe alluded to, what Dr. Greenspan was talking about is that growing overweighted wealth at the top means far less consumption and investment in all the layers below, and this is the root of our economic situation, isn't it?
I think you're absolutely right. It's good to see Brother Alan Greenspan making that claim, because he's made a major contribution in promoting wealth equality for a long time. And it has much to do with what's going on, not just on Wall Street, with the movement that I'm proud to be a small part of, but all around the country and the world. It has to do with corporate greed in the military-industrial complex, the corporate greed connected to the prison-industrial complex, the corporate greed on Wall Street, and the corporate greed even on the corporate media, where we poison the public discourse by appealing to the lowest common denominator, so we don't have a robust public conversation in the way in which Brother Joe was talking about it. Some quality, some critical exchange, but rather just demonizing, polarizing, and some very, very vicious kinds of exchanges.
I want to finish by actually, I don't usually do this, but I'm going to do it now, because it seems that Christianity is constantly being thrown into primary debates. It happened again this past weekend. And how fascinating that despite the fact that many on the right have brought religion up over the past 30, 40 years, they somehow miss the core of Jesus' message. Jesus was asked, and I want you guys to comment on this, by his disciples, who's getting to heaven? How do we sit on the right hand of the Father? This is what Jesus Christ said. And by the way, Pastor Jeffress, this is, if you open your Bible to Matthew, it's in red letters. That means Jesus said it. And this is what Jesus said. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me, and that was not Jesus talking about some side issue, some sidebar to his ministry. That was Jesus talking about when asked what his ministry was about. It was about taking care of the poor.
That's right.
And you don't see that from the very people who wave their Bibles around the most, guys.
No, go right ahead, though.
No, I mean, we can go farther than that. There's so many references in the biblical text that talk about taking care of, looking out for the poor. You can go to the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor. What you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. We could get into the hermeneutics all day long of how to treat the poor relative to the biblical text, and that's exactly what we have to say to all believers in this country. That if we truly are believers, we have to do everything we can to raise up the poor, particularly, again, as these numbers continue to grow exponentially.
So we got to keep in mind, Jesus was crucified because when he entered Jerusalem, he ran out the marketeers out of the temple and said, you have transformed a house of prayer into a house of thieves. That's also connected to the Occupy Wall Street movement. That Jesus, you can throw Jesus under the bus by corporate greed, by downplaying our precious children, our precious workers, and our precious middle class, even who are subject to downward mobility. Absolutely.
The Poverty Tour series airs this week on PBS. Dr. Cornel West and Tavis Smiley, thank you very much for being on the show. We look forward to watching it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.